Yeah.
La, la, la. Anyone else tired? It's been long, right?
Yeah.
8 weeks. How the hell did I used to do this when I was a school teacher? This is each 25 hours a week. I was young. Don't pick a career where you have to stand up. Very important. Always be sitting, okay?
I want to be a lecturer.
Always. You want to be a lecturer?
Yeah.
Are you fucking insane? We get paid peanuts to talk to empty rooms. Don't be a lecturer. Be anything else. Be the guy who cleans out the sewers. You will get more respect from people. Be the guy who, you know, I don't know, cleans up the strip club after the end of the shift. You'll get more respect from people every time. Right, so this is the penultimate lecture of this module. Given that there's only 13 people here, I don't expect this to be revelational for everyone. Kind of drop this in as a topic which is designed to have inbuilt redundancy, because I know nobody's going to turn up the week before Easter when the assignments are due on Thursday. I always, you kind of predict that this isn't going to happen. So, congratulations to all of you who have attended, though. I will try to plough through this crap as quickly as possible so you can have the rest of the afternoon off, but I will at least give the lecture for you. Is there anyone for whom this topic, protest via social media, has any particular relevance? Just out of interest?
I have a protesting Twitter.
How do you protest on Twitter?
Posting
Posting about what?
about algorithm that technology is the dictatorship in China and about argument with people.
Let me ask you a question. Do you intend to return to China after your studies?
I don't want to.
But do you think that might happen?
Yeah, it might happen, but I don't want to.
If you think it might happen, delete every post that you've made that's critical of the Chinese government to date. Because they will archive them.
Yeah, so.
Get rid of them.
Okay.
Now. Do it now. Don't even take notes. Do it now. If you're intending to go on holiday to somewhere like China and you've made critical posts about their government, delete them. Okay?
I mean, it's kind of a protest thing, but no, basically, it was a bit of a social media oops, let's call it. But at the start of like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I'm like half Russian,
Okay.
and I go to like a kind of community center in London. And the one that I go to happens to be run like from America, but on social media they linked it, like somebody linked it to something run by like the Russian government, and we ended up having a protest, like people outside protesting outside the center because they thought it was like this other place. They messed up on social media and said it was there.
But you were therefore the subject of a protest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Accidentally.
I've always wanted people to protest against me. But nobody seems to want to do it, you know? Why is this foul-mouthed imbecile teaching people? You should be like that, but no, it's not. That's interesting. Did you get into their social media discourse about it? Did you go and have a look to see what was being said? And
Oh yeah, it was wild.
yeah, and very much formed on disinformation.
Very much so.
Okay, which is
Yeah.
interesting in itself too. I think the Russia-Ukraine conflict, in many different ways, has been a great example of how social media platforms are utilised in protest, both in sensible, sort of respectful and authoritative ways, and in wildly inappropriate ways as well. what's interesting over the last couple of years is that's now been superseded by what's occurring in Gaza, where we've seen some of the features that have occurred with the Russia-Ukraine crisis and conflict replicated, but if you like, the extreme ends that were going on there have become the most vocal part of the Gaza conflict. For example, I think there was a more reasoned discourse around, support for the Russian people with regards to the, this is not in the name of many of the Russian people, etc. It's these kind of points, and I think that's been taken to really extreme ends with regards to the Israel-Palestine conflict in Gaza, where we see any comment made about pro-Palestine, that means you're an anti-Semite. Well, no, it doesn't. Anti-Semitic comments are actually a very nuanced form of commentary. To be anti-Semitic actually doesn't mean you're an you might be anti-Zionist, for example, but you're not anti-Semitic. But all the nuances are lost in those kind of things. And we saw elements of that with Ukraine and Russia, but it's been magnified on a vast scale. And similarly, if you're critical of Hamas and the Palestinian authorities, also you're anti-Muslim. Well, no, they don't equate to being the same thing, actually. And there's a very specific discourse you can have about being anti a religion, but that doesn't mean you're anti the political stance. If you're anti the political stance of Hamas, that doesn't mean you're anti all Muslims, for example. But what's interesting is that people who are anti-Muslim have been strongly anti-Palestinian as well. So, and people who don't like Jews tend to be really anti-Israel. So there's conflations of different positions that go on here, which I think has been magnified intensely. We saw some of that with Ukraine and Russia. I think it was just harder for people in the West to get involved with Ukraine and Russia because, do you know what? If you look at a Ukrainian and you look at a Russian, tell me the difference. You know what I mean? And it's much harder for people in the West to have that kind of binary going on with Ukraine and Russia, but much easier in the conflict in Palestine. Anyway, these are two interesting examples, I think, of social media being utilised to give wider commentary on something which is a real world conflict. Obviously, there is a real conflict in Ukraine. There is a real conflict in Gaza at the moment. People are dying in tens of thousands in both countries. What's interesting to me is, in the West, we sort of now have given up on Ukraine. So it's not in the papers anymore. Nobody cares anymore. That's really not great. And now we're dominated by news about Gaza every day, which is still interesting. But it took us a long time to actually get around to the fact. You know what? Yeah, October the 7th was horrific, and what happened on October the 7th was horrific. But there were tens of thousands of people dying. And that's also horrific. So these are real-life conflicts which are being commented on social media. Brings me to a good way to start this lecture. For me, there are two kinds of protests that take place on social media. There are those which relate directly to things which are going on in real life, such as the conflict in Ukraine or the conflict in Gaza at the moment. And there is a secondary kind of social media protest, which is a protest which is, if you like, brought about on and concentrated and focused within social media itself. Now, an example of that, and I think the best example of it, and the reason why it's fresh in my head, because I've literally just written like the penultimate chapter of the textbook that I'm writing, and it is about, that chapter was about intersectionality in digital media, and I wrote a very long case study piece on the Me Too movement. Do you all know what I'm talking about when I say Me Too?
Yeah.
So, Me Too is a hashtag which came to prominence in 2017. In particular, it's associated with an actress called Alyssa Milano. Some of you may have heard of Alyssa Milano, some of you may not have heard of Alyssa Milano. If you've seen a really terrible television program called Charmed, Alyssa Milano was one of the people on that. But she had a Hollywood career going back much further than that as well. But that idea of Me Too actually came about, first of all, in 2006 on the social network MySpace. The first recorded use of that term as a protest against sexual harassment in wider society. This wasn't focused on Hollywood, but in wider society was in 2006 on MySpace. So it was actually a movement which arose out of social media itself, and utilising the network features of social media to share experiences that women had had in society of harassment, and to use social media as a way to share those across people so that there was a support network that came through from other users who recognised that kind of harassment. So it's not by any means a new thing. We're talking 18 years ago now that started. It became a big thing in 2017, and that utilised actually the hashtag feature of Twitter itself in order to propel that forwards. And obviously it claimed, I don't want to say it claimed scalps, but it brought justice to some seriously horrific individuals. The one that everyone knows about is Harvey Weinstein, but Harvey Weinstein was not alone in Me Too. And what kind of saddens me about Me Too a little bit is that the work was only like a 10th done. That Me Too should have been a lot more powerful than it was, but because of some of the nature of social media as well, you can shut down people just as well. People who posted in Me Too also were on the end of horrific abuse for being sexually harassed, assaulted, raped, etc. So that's the other side of social media right there. So what I want to do in the lecture is just cover the idea of social media as a site of political protests, and this idea of social media as a site of hegemonic struggle. So that's taken from Gramsci, right? The idea that all communication in some way is an attempt to change the hegemonic order. If social media is a site of hegemonic struggle, therefore a place where people can change opinions on issues through social media posting, that sits in direct conflict with the actual ownership of social media, which is extremely conservative and looks to shut down this kind of debate that goes on. And there's ample evidence from Me Too in particular, but more from Resist Trump, where social media companies were actively working to shut down that by shadow banning people, by using algorithms to depopularize content in particular ways, to push people away from protest because it suited the political ends of the platforms themselves not to have people engaging with this. In this year that we are in, 2024, this is going to be extremely interesting again, this idea of the platform having power. In particular, X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, is going to come into sharp focus this year because X is now owned by somebody who supports Donald Trump. And Elon Musk could sit here and say, no, that's not true. And I say, Elon, shut the fuck up. You're an idiot. Shut up. You support Donald Trump. There is no other way of explaining his political process. Twitter as a platform might well become weaponized in this election in a way that it's never been done before, because you will see controls put on information spread that is critical towards Donald Trump. And we're already seeing that happen. There's a lot of political commentators in America who are commenting that just the impressions that they're getting are being radically altered by X's algorithms at the moment. So that critical commentary on Trump, I don't know if anyone saw Trump on the weekend, but it was unhinged on the weekend. He was doing a public speech and it was so windy there that the teleprompters didn't work. Yeah. Okay. So he had to freewheel it. Some of the stuff he was coming out with was absolutely bizarre. Like, for example, he claimed that Joe Biden had run against Barack Obama in an election.
Yeah, that
didn't happen. Never happened. Joe Biden was Barack Obama's vice president for 8 years. He never stood against Barack Obama in an election. It's like, he went on about that for 10 minutes. I was like, whew, nuts. He's crazy. Okay, but go and look for that on Twitter. You ain't gonna find it very easily. They are strangling that. Now, loads of people have posted content about it, but it is being strangled down. So, my point here about hegemonic struggle is it's almost people who want change against the platforms themselves. You can use these platforms as a site for protest, then you're not only fighting against public opinion, but you're also fighting against the platform itself, who may well be against you. And I'm going to talk about these in particular. Now, I wouldn't expect any of you particularly to know much about the Arab Spring, or necessarily the Occupy movement, because they're historic now, but I use them and continue to use them because they are important in terms of the roots of where social media struggle comes from. I'll talk about Me Too, I'll talk about Resist Trump, I'll talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter as well, which is as problematic, but a lot of the features of why Black Lives Matter is problematic is actually covered in the Me Too discussion as well, so I'll kind of cross-reference the two. So, going back to Henry Jenkins again, because he's always coming up. What does Henry Jenkins say? Spreadable media is incredibly important. The roots of protest on social media come from the idea that media can spread on these platforms. Very, very simple. Social media is an effective conduit to protest in society because messages can be spread virally via these platforms and get to a large number of people. If you were to have a protest before social media, what would you have to do? Any ideas? Posters, flyers. What would those posters and flyers say? Meet at this place at this time. What if you can't get there? You don't go. What if you're working? Can't go, etc. You know, what if you're busy? What if you've got kids? What if you've got, you know, your car's broken down, etc. You can't go. So, the idea of protest in the past, of getting a mass movement of people, was to get a mass movement of people together. Logistically, that's not always a possibility. So, well, how does social media help you? Well, we don't need to get together. Social media allows, if you like, a decentralized protest. You don't all have to be in the same place at the same time with the same message. The message can be the same, but people can be distant from one another, but you can still have that critical mass of an idea that there is a protest movement going on, because it's visible that so many people are involved in this. And you can see that visibility in a number of ways. The number of posts made on a particular topic, the number of likes that posts get, the number of shares that posts get, the amount of traffic which is related to that topic on a network. These all become important indicators that a protest itself is going to be really important, or is having some important effect. So, it kind of fits with Jenkins' idea that grassroots advocates power forward content on social media, and that becomes meaningful. I'm usually deeply suspicious of Henry Jenkins, but I kind of think this idea fits when we talk about protest movements, because protest movements on social media are very often ground up movements where people surface issues of particular kinds and then push those forwards. One very good example of this, during COVID, a small protest movement emerged about this institution online. The students were complaining about the quality and quantity of teaching materials.
Yeah, I know it, and we are asking for refund.
Not so much asking for refunds, because the asking for refunds thing was absurd, because you'd signed a contract. You can't ask for a refund once you've signed a contract. But it was more around that there were certain courses which weren't providing adequate materials for students to actually learn during COVID, and it did have an effect, because the university is very worried about any kind of bad press that it might get, especially on social media. So those things were picked up by marketing, intelligence and so on, fed through to the senior management team. Senior management team brings down the thunder on the places where it was identified, changes were made. Are students happy? I don't really think they got much happier about things, but you couldn't say that the changes weren't at least made. That is a great example of how people at a ground level who are experiencing an issue surface it via social media, and knowing, like, social media savvy. How are you going to get Swansea University to change things if you just talk about it on social media? Well, you're copying in the university's official account. You're copying in the Vice-Chancellor, for example, or the important people in the university into these complaints using a really derogatory hashtag, and you get lots of traction for it. All of a sudden you go, shit, we've got to shut this down. Then you get some real action to go. So what Jenkins is talking about here, I think, does work and does map onto things. So, the use of social media as a site of political protest definitely fits with this notion of participatory culture, if it wasn't full of holes to begin with, because what Jenkins ignores about participatory culture is the idea that platforms are actually owned by companies. And still, we have to take that into account. What's weird to me is that people don't realise, if you're protesting against something on social media, it's perfectly within the scope of social media companies to make sure nobody sees that material. That isn't something difficult for them to do. And indeed, we have huge evidence for this. TikTok, for example, had a real image problem at the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, when it was literally shutting down material which was critical of particular Russian operations in Ukraine. It was looking at hashtags and literally making anything that used those hashtags invisible. Nobody could see them. Perfectly within the scope of any social network to do that. All you do, what are you asking them to do? Right, we're going to filter out anything that's got that hashtag in it. You know, that's child's play stuff. You know? So the participatory culture element is always sitting in a dynamic with what the platform itself is going to allow you to do. To give you a sort of an example on a tangent to this, some of you may be aware that for several years there has been a movement on Instagram about breastfeeding. Well, maybe you're not aware. Do you know, well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever seen somebody breastfeeding on Instagram?
No.
Why not?
Well, good. It's a privacy thing. It's a personal thing.
No. What's more natural than breastfeeding? Why can't you see images of breastfeeding on Instagram?
Sensible sexual content.
100%. Instagram's terms and conditions and their content moderation policies label breastfeeding infants as sexually unacceptable content. And that post will be taken down. They have AI to take it down, but they also have content moderation, which will look to take that down as well. So for a number of years now, there has been a protest movement on Instagram about women. Now, if you're a bloke and you're on Instagram and you have a picture of yourself with no shirt on, does that get taken down? No. So what is it that's so offensive about women's nipples which is not offensive about men's nipples? Because let's be fair, women's nipples at least have a use. Yeah, don't look for a sensible answer. There is no sensible answer. This is just the weird conservatism of Meta as a company here. It's like, yeah, we can't have women's breasts on show, but you know, even when they're being used to feed infants, you know, which is the most natural thing in the earth, but you know, men do whatever the fuck you want. So again, that is an example of how a platform enforces a particular policy to shut down a particular right. Now, I completely here or there on it. I don't really care either way. But, you know, it's probably not content which is ever going to come up on my feed, let's be fair. But, you know, it is an example of how the policies of a particular social network influence the type of content that actually becomes visible on it. Now, although this is problematic, we can still use some of these principles in order to understand what happens in protests. So what does happen on protests? Well, networks allow for people with the same ideas that are distanced by space and time to cooperate and coordinate in real time. That, for me, is the most important point about social media protest, and it's one that I laboured to make earlier, but that puts it in more concise language. a social media platform allows people with the same ideas that are distanced from one another by space and time to coordinate in real time to get messages out to a wider audience. And that can be done despite the inherent dangers in such communication utilising proprietary platforms. You can take ways of doing that. Now, it's no surprise that the major social network that has been used in protest movements has been Twitter, or X as it's now called. But can anyone tell me why? Why is that one better than the others for doing protests?
It's quite easy to see what's trending. Like as soon as you go onto kind of the homepage, you can go and search, and then before you even search anything, it tells you what's trending.
That's true enough, but it's not that's not the primary reason. But that is a very good reason. Okay, it's a very, very simple thing, and we're probably overthinking it a little bit. On Twitter/X, you can be anyone you need to be. There's no real name policy attachment here. It doesn't have to be linked to anything real. This is why you get millions and millions of trolls and bots on that network. It doesn't have to be grounded in any kind of reality. Now that's important in protest, because very often people will want to remain anonymous when they're protesting against a particular cause. If you imagine that you're in a country like Myanmar, or Burma as it was once known, and you are protesting against the government's policies against Muslims in that country, you don't want to be visible to the government in that country, especially if you're posting from within it. But on Twitter/X, you don't have to be. You can just set up an account and do all that advocacy work. You won't be linked to you as an individual at that point. The other social networks make it much more difficult to do that, unfortunately. You have to set up a Meta account or something like that. It has to be anchored to an email address. You will get turned down if that email address has existed for like 2 seconds. They will want, because this is part of their business model, that they link all content back to individuals who they can then sell as a data subject to advertisers. Twitter is much looser about that, and they've tried at times to kind of clamp down on this behaviour. Sensibly, they've kind of pushed back on those clampdowns as well, because there is an understanding within that company that people use this anonymously for a number of different reasons. It's not just for trolling celebrities, it's also for actually trying to do some good as well. So, depending on the kind of network you're using and which network you're using, this can be more or less successful. Now, the first major, what we call social media protest, or what was termed social media protest, is actually this one. I always said Me Too started in 2006, but Me Too did not become a protest movement until much later than that. It was more of an advocacy visibility movement at that point. The first major, what we saw as social media revolutions, occurred in 2011, and what was known as the Arab Spring. So, how old were you guys in 2011? 8? 7? 9? Okay. Good times. This was all occurring and you had no knowledge of it whatsoever. Good times. So, 2011 cast our minds back. You won't remember it, but I remember it very well. It was a time when half the planet was on fire. Good times, I enjoyed it. It was great. Not least, large parts of London as well were on fire at that point in time, and I fucking hate London, so, burn it down, but yeah, it was a year of revolutions, major protests, riots, and the emergence of social movements. 2011 was exciting times to live in. You might ask, well, why was 2011 so important? We're in the 3rd year after the great financial crash of 2008. Massive precipitous drop in living standards across the entire world, not just localized to the Western world, but across the entire planet. It meant 3 years of the emergence of austerity politics, 3 years of people losing their homes, their jobs, money becoming worthless, etc. People were sick and tired of it, and oppressive regimes across the world suddenly found themselves under major problems, because You know, you can get away with oppressing people for a long time if people have got money in their pockets and food on their plates. But when that starts to stop, then oppressive regimes are in big trouble at that point, and they start to get overthrown. And in particular in the Middle East, this became a major, major problem. So, 2011 was the year of the rebirth of history, a year in which people tried to change history by protest. It wasn't very successful, would be my point about what Alan Badiou says, but nevertheless, it was something that tried to happen. The year of dreaming dangerous, a year in which people dared to try and make dreams of a different world a reality. Now, people in media studies in particular picked up on this as it was happening and afterwards and said, well, the way that people were dreaming dangerously, as Slavoj Žižek says, is by sharing their experiences and calling for radical change via social media. The key conduit to the changes that were wanted and the mechanisms by which people were going about it was social media itself. At the time, I thought, nah, social media is not that important in this. And a lot of people argued against it. And now I think, nah, social media wasn't that important in this. But it was interesting at the time to be involved in these conversations, because I was just finishing up my PhD at the time, and I was like, I actually know about this stuff now, I can make comment about it, but I think I was right. So, 2011, a year where dreams of a different world were put into political practice. What you had in 2011 was mass protest movements against governments around the world which utilised the network features of social media to create the idea of political change. Instead of having mass protests in the streets, you could have mass protests on Facebook, on Twitter, and it, for the first time really, it seemed as if people were actually paying attention, including governments, to what was going on social media and reacting to the social media content. Previously, any events like this would have involved some kind of public display of protest, like the ones you were just talking about, right? You've got to get together, you've got to get in the street, you've got to be visible to people. The visibility of social media protest in 2011 was like, oh wow, okay, this is going to take over the traditional mode of doing things. To borrow from Marx, you actually see a consciousness arise on social media which can affect the real in particular ways. Now, unsurprisingly, those who were really important at the time, like Manuel Castells, analysed the role of social media and communication power. Castells focused on the revolution in Tunisia, so part of the Arab world, and the Egyptian revolutions, as well as protests in Iceland, the Spanish 15M movement, and the Occupy Wall Street movement. So what Castells argues in his books Network of Outrage and Hope, that the Arab uprisings were spontaneous processes of mobilization that emerged from calls from the internet and wireless communication networks. So for Castells, political protest did not emerge in the streets of Cairo. It emerged on Facebook and Twitter and websites, and then coalesced in protests on the streets. So the entire direction of protest had changed, not from street protest to political change, but from internet protest to street protest to political change that way. The primary driver and engine of this was online communication. And he says much the same about the Occupy movement. It was born in the internet, fused by the internet, and maintained its presence on the internet. Does anyone know what the hell I'm talking about with the Occupy movement? Okay, so the Occupy movement is most associated with Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street was a protest movement that began 2009 and literally was occupying a space in Wall Street in New York. Wall Street, the home of financial district in New York City, and therefore, by proxy, the home of the global financial system. In 2008, the global financial system basically came within minutes of collapsing entirely, and only through massive bailouts by governments worldwide was the global financial system secured. Banks on Wall Street went bust, most famously Lehman Brothers, but Lehman Brothers, I should say, but also Bear Stearns and other investment banks went bankrupt. That created mass inflation, it created unemployment, you know, prices crashed, people went through the ringer. In protest of the fact that the bankers have once again been bailed out by governments, and let's be fair, where do governments get their money from? Can anyone answer me that question? Hmm? Where primarily?
Bank.
The taxpayer. We. Anyone work here?
No.
Okay. How many deductions get taken out of your pay? A lot. Guess where they go? 40% of my wages per month go to the government for taxation, right? So, in protest of the idea that once again the global financial system had been bailed out by ordinary everyday people who did nothing to create the problems which it had actually went down for, the Occupy Wall Street movement emerged as one of the movements of protest against it. And it was literally an Occupy movement. Opposite the Dow Jones Stock Exchange on Wall Street, there's a park. And Occupy Wall Street was literally a movement where they went and occupied the park for like nearly a decade. That was there for like up until about 2018, I think. They finally cleared out the protest site. They had one in London, opposite St Paul's Cathedral, and in various sites around the world as well, particularly where those sites are relevant to financial interest. There's one in Frankfurt in Germany. There was a few other places where they had these as well. The protests in Iceland were revolving around much the same issues. The Icelandic banking industry completely collapsed in 2009. The Icelandic government decided to bail them all out. Who paid for that? The people of Iceland, effectively. They all became extremely poor because of that, and etc., etc. So, Occupy as a movement, although it had a physical characteristic to it, as in there was an occupation of a space, its actual traction came online. People followed the Occupy movement. People followed the hashtag. People tweeted out in support of Occupy, used the hashtag to indicate their support. Now, so for Castells, both the Arab Spring and these revolutionary movements in the Middle East and North Africa, and the Occupy movement against sort of the continuing financial support for the finance industry by Western governments, were both out of the internet. So Castells puts a strong emphasis on the mobilization capacities of the internet. His argument implies that in study cases, internet communication created street protests, which means that without the internet, there wouldn't have been a street protest in the first place. So the direction of causality here means if you didn't have social media, nobody would have protested against this. Ding, 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 ding. I don't think that's correct. I think you still would have had protests against this even if you didn't have social media. The history of humankind tells us that people actually protest when this shit happens. But maybe Castells has a point about one thing here, that the speed and visibility of those protests was improved by the presence of social media. I'm not going to argue with that point. Whether they wouldn't have happened at all is a much more difficult point. So how does Castells construct this argument? Well, the networked social movements of our time are largely based on the internet, a necessary though not sufficient component of their collective action. Now, to understand what he means there, you need a rather advanced degree in philosophy, I'm afraid, so let me try and unpack it for you. In philosophy, we have a system called necessary and sufficient conditions. A necessary condition is something that has to happen for something else to happen. But a sufficient condition is something which on its own would make that other thing happen. So for a necessary condition, you would usually have lots of other necessary conditions, but on their own they are not sufficient to make that thing happen. So for example, you can boil it down to a football match. Okay? What do you need for a football match to happen? Well, you need a ball, you need players, you need a field, etc. But a field on its own is not sufficient for a football match to occur. A ball on its own is not sufficient for that to occur. Players on their own, if you don't have the other things, it's not going to happen, so they're not sufficient conditions. So for Castells, the presence of social media made it was entirely necessary, but it wasn't sufficient for these to occur. Digital networks based on the internet and wireless platforms are decisive tools for mobilizing, for organizing, for deliberating, for coordinating, and for deciding. What he's saying is that protest in the digital age, the digital itself is necessary for any protest to happen. It's not sufficient because you still need one other thing, which is people. You can't do it just by digital alone. But those two things become so closely intertwined with one another that they become almost sufficient conditions on their own. So, and the result of that is this kind of nonsense which came out of it. The internet resulted in the emergence of movements. That movements were born on the internet, that protests were conveyed by the internet, or that the movements are based on the internet. That is all logically technological determinism. Basically, all that says is that if the internet didn't exist, none of these things would happen. And again, I don't feel that that's correct in any way. If you have massively repressive regimes who are crushing the population of that country and drowning them in debt because of decisions made by someone else, you're going to get protests anyway. But the way that the Twitter and Facebook revolutions of 2011 were actually analysed suggested that nothing could happen without the presence of these. This is what we call a technologically determinist argument. So technology is conceived an actor that results in certain phenomena of societal characteristics. If you're in a technologically determinist position, you're on the wrong side of the argument always. So Castells fails to see that it's not the internet that creates sociality, but human actors who are embedded in antagonistic in economic, political and ideological structures of society. What Castells gets wrong here is the role of social media and digital media in society. Castells conflates the 2 points. Says society and digital media are the same thing. Actually, what way we should think of it is that we access society and society is influenced by digital media, but they're not one and the same thing themselves. Because if they were, then we'd have no agency through them. So instead, where Castells fails here is that the internet isn't the social itself, there is a world outside of it. Unfortunately, this is a kind of thing that always goes on in media studies, where people look at the media and think it's so important that nothing could happen without it. And it's like, that's not what history teaches us. History teaches us that a lot of protest movements happen globally without any of this happening. What we need to understand is how actually digital media has mediated protest, not how it's created it, because it didn't create it, it always existed. The internet is simply a techno-social system, right? Consisting of social networks that make use of a global network. Now technology is embedded in the antagonisms of contemporary society, and collective social action that makes use of the internet can have relatively few effects. And the actual implication always depends on things which are outside the technology itself, like context, power relations, resources, mobilization capacities, strategies and tactics, as well as the complex and undetermined outcomes of struggles. All of the wider context in which things were taking place was ignored, and people just went to say, yeah, the internet made that happen. Or, social media made that happen. The people of Egypt rose up against their government because of social media. It's like, whoa, the people of Egypt had legitimate complaints about their government. They didn't need social media to do this. So Castells' model is way too simplistic. Basically, all he says is social media results in revolutions and rebellions. And he talks about Twitter revolutions and Facebook revolutions. The first became popular when the conservative blogger Andrew Sullivan claimed that the revolution will be twittered in the context of the 2009 Iran protests. Okay, so here's the issue with this. Basically, you have a bunch of white Western guys looking at protests in the Arab world and saying, you wouldn't be able to do that if it wasn't for us. Because you have guys like Castells and Andrew Sullivan standing there saying, the only way you can get political change in your country is by using our networks, by using Twitter, an American network, by using Facebook, an American network. This is our gift to you. You can create the change that you've always wanted in your country if you adopt our tools for getting that change. And they will be responsible for that change. We're going to give all the credit to Twitter, we're going to give all the credit to Facebook. It's not the people who actually go out in the streets as important, because you wouldn't have gone out in the streets without us. We caused it to happen. This is like white saviour syndrome on Coke at this point, right? And it's not just rubbish Coke, it's uncut stuff, okay, at this point as well. So, the whole media studies discourse about this just reeks of white saviour. That, you know, once again, America is going to come and save the world for you, but this time we're just going to give you the tools to do it. We're going to make it happen for you. We're going to give you these networks. Yeah, we're going to take all your data. Yeah, we're going to do all that stuff on the slide as well. But we're going to give you these tools so you can overthrow your governments with it. I mean, the reality of society is much more simplistic, much more complex than this very simplistic model. And the media, social media, and the internet are contradictory because we live in a contradictory society. They can help, but also do not at times help. Now, the picture on this slide, none of you guys will remember this. You're going to have to trust me, okay? And you can look it up afterwards. Coney 2012. Has anyone even ever heard of this?
No.
Good. Excellent. So, Coney 2012 was a protest movement on Facebook about, I can't even to this day, I'm not even sure what the hell it was about. But Coney refers to a man, Joseph Coney. And Joseph Coney was identified as a warlord in a Central African country called the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, the Democratic Republic of Congo is, I think, the 8th largest country in the world. It was a former Belgian colony, which achieved its independence from Belgium in between the two World Wars. And since independence has had a fairly horrific history, unfortunately. It's been the subject of multiple sort of coups and multiple sort of changes of governance which haven't been necessarily democratic. This is not unusual in sub-Saharan Africa, but where the Democratic Republic of Congo is slightly different is it should be one of the wealthiest countries on earth. It has massive resources of rare earth minerals, all the major metal groups, coal, oil, gas, etc. It has every natural resource that you can possibly ever think of having. It is one of the poorest countries on earth because it is grossly exploited and has been fought over by small groups ever since its inception. And Joseph Coney is a warlord in that country, fighting one of the many, many different conflicts that have been going on basically since the country was formed. In 2012, a number of very odd documentary-style videos came out about Joseph Coney using child soldiers in his militia. And a protest movement on Facebook went up, which kind of spread around the world, where people started protesting, you know, stop this, you know. Coney 2012, we've got to stop the use of child soldiers in DRC. And it went absolutely viral. Now, there was only one really, I mean, I'm not against stopping child soldiers, right? That sounds reasonable to me. If you know, don't use child soldiers. If you're gonna like take over the country, don't use kids, right? That sounds reasonable enough to me. The problem with this was, like you then asked people, like, you know, what do you know about the conflict? What do you know about the Democratic Republic of Congo? Like, what? What's that? Nobody knew a fucking thing about any of this. And they're like, well, do you think Joseph Coney's opponents have child soldiers? I don't know. They do. They really do. You know? Do you know who funds Joseph Coney? It's us. Because he represents Western interests in the country. You know? Etc., etc. Nobody had a fucking clue what they were talking about. So Coney 2012 came and went really quickly. People latched onto the idea that, yeah, we can protest against something which is really important, but without having a single idea about what the hell was going on here. And as soon as people started investigating this, they were like, none of this makes sense. None of this makes any sense at all. Now, the reason why I raise it at this point is, for Castells, this would have been some kind of really important movement, but it wasn't. It was a complete illusory thing. Nobody had a clue what was going on. Nobody had any information, any context at all. If you wanted to learn about the Democratic Republic of Congo and its problems, you can go and find that out. I bet 9 out of 10 people couldn't even find it on a map. And like I said, it's the 8th biggest country in the world. It's not small. If you dropped a pin on Africa, you've got a pretty good chance of hitting it. But social media protest of this kind illustrates something really, really important. Just because there's a protest on, just because loads of people are tracking it, doesn't mean people are serious about it. Nobody was really engaging in this. It was had any idea what it was doing, and apart from the vague idea that they shouldn't be child soldiers, it was okay, I think we can all agree on that. How are you going to fix the problems of the Democratic Republic of Congo? I didn't even know it existed until you just told me. So you have no context at all about what is going on there, why these people are fighting one another, how we're involved as a country, and how the rest of the Western world is involved, and other adjutants around the world as well, etc., etc. Social media protests on their own are not really that great. Now, some of the analysis of the Arab Spring really puts holes in the idea that social media started.